are complicated. Some of the things I talk about are complicated. So, you
Yeah.
know, if it's not a space where complexity is appreciated, then I shouldn't speak at all, unless I can
Um,
somehow bridge that story gap we always talk about. How do you
I
wrap a
think
story around that to bring these complicated ideas? So how do we wrap a story around the fact that I trust Sam, that he has made a contract with us and we're all sharing user fructing the videos, but
mm,
he's not in full power to ensure the safety of those videos. So even though I trust him, Josh is saying, well, he can't make that full commitment. He can only commit to the parts that he's ownership of, and he doesn't own YouTube, and YouTube can shut him down. So have we thought about that? Do we care?
well, look, if I have a master copy, like let's say that we agree, just us in the room, that each of us can have our own copy of these conversations. We have that stored on our own hard drives or somewhere, and we can put it on YouTube, and somebody else can copy it, and then potentially it could be used in all kinds of ways, which wouldn't prevent me from still having access. So it's the integrity of the recording, right? That's essential in some sense. Then the secondary issue is if somebody else has a copy of it and they do whatever with that copy, change it, is something like. And then Josh says you can have an agreement that would, imply that I could potentially sue a person for doing that. And I would prefer a system where I didn't even have to think about that. So maybe there's something there. I think there's something there that me and Josh haven't quite understood, or one of us haven't understood, or we're thinking about this in slightly different ways. But I'm still having real trouble getting my mind around the issue of ownership of a piece of data. Um, Apart from having access to the source, right?
Yeah,
And
there's also a concept of fair use. So if somebody has created a piece of art or a piece of literature or a piece of academic material or a piece of entertainment, you can reference it and cite it in small amounts for fair use, for educational purposes, or to criticize it or to review it. And it's a little bit fuzzy exactly how much usage is considered fair use. And you can also do parodies of things. And a parody is considered a legally acceptable use of somebody else's original material. So this is not a trivial issue. This is a very nasty, complicated issue, and it varies from one country to the next.
exactly, and that's why I'm feeling that I
Yeah,
would like something
Canada's more
simpler.
strict. Canada's more strict. I've heard in the past in the United States. That's why our humor isn't as cutting as the American humor, because we can get sued in Canada for, making fun of the Queen or something, where in the States they can't.
But
Like
what if I?
defacing. I think if you do a video of defacing the Queen in Canada, you can get charged. If you do that in the United States, you can't. Like, I'm
You've
not
got
sure if that's true or not, but that's something like that.
you've got that Canadian currency where they changed the image to look like Spock from one of the government officials. You've seen that, right?
I don't know. It sounds funny.
Oh yeah, look it up. There's some Canadian currency that's got the face of some official, and with a little bit of simple, sketching, you can make it look like Spock. And
I haven't seen money in so long. I don't even know what it looks like.
yeah,
Yeah.
look up Canadian currency looks like Spock, and you'll see it. You'll find it.
Yeah, somebody I think highlighted the eyebrows and we're there.
Yeah, yeah. It's been in circulation for, I don't know, probably 10 years or more now.
The $5 bill. Okay, is
$5
that
bill.
John A? Who's that?
I don't. You can look up and tell me who the original image.
I'm really bad with history, Barry. I need history people around me.
Just read the annotation that goes with the story. It'll tell you who it is.
All I'm getting are Google pictures here.
For example,
Star Trek.
you, But Barry, you, for example, said that everyone can use things you've written and they can change it and do whatever they want with it, more or less, right? And if we have a system where we want all the expressions to be able to evolve, wouldn't any kind of copyright be a fundamental restriction on that? Even if there's, you know, some vague possibility that I could sue somebody or that some lawsuit could occur, wouldn't that in itself be an inhibiting factor to the process of just creatively building and building and building? Because the vision I have is some kind of system where everyone can build on what everyone else brings, and they can reproduce an almost exact same version of it, maybe with one change.
Yeah.
And
that's called copyleft. Richard Stallman was a big promoter of what you just talked about, where instead of copyright, you have copyleft, and everybody agrees that you can make a modification, but then you have to publish the modification, and anybody else can continue the process indefinitely. So that's the alternative concept to copyright, which is a restriction. Copyleft is an invitation and an allowance that everybody can build on everybody else's work.
Exactly, yeah. Because there's also another related idea here, and that is that if we're speaking about ideas that potentially seek something that's globally scalable, and that is connected to what we might call a global all-win scenario, in the sense, so in other words, let's say we move past the age of scarcity and we move into more sort of an abundance reality, that there's a certain type of ideas that, for example, ideas that have to do with economy, of using existing resources in a system in new ways so as to create more value, but it doesn't need any more extraction of resources, etc., etc. It would seem that those kind of ideas, by their very nature, would not need to be owned.
It can't be in the United States. An idea, a pure idea, cannot be copyrighted or patented. A reduction to practice can be, but the raw idea, the abstract idea, cannot be copyrighted or patented.
Yeah, software is a great place to look into for a lot of these battles of ideas, and what Josh is saying, it becomes a thing, and then they say, "Oh, I own that thing." And there's the Creative Commons too. Like, there's many ways to share free software. You can share it, but you have to attribute. You can share, you have to attribute, but you can't make money off it. You can share it, make money off it, but you don't have to attribute it, which is the Richard Stallman one. You can do whatever you want with it.
So I like to do whatever you want with it simply because it's so simple.
Well, think about this one. Let's take into context this conversation with the corona and the availability of getting a virus shot, and whether you think that that's a true thing or not, whether the vaccine is actually a thing or whether it's a conspiracy of the government. You know, why would people say, "I don't want it"? Why would they say that? They say, "I don't need it. I don't think I need it." Like, I don't know what their thinking process is, but they definitely haven't made it up to the mark of what I would consider real logic or an informed opinion where they're actually using empathy. Like, maybe they don't have empathy, so they can't feel that there's a need. I don't know why but there you go. There's something that's been made readily available for everybody. It's pretty well, I would think, scientific and made into common knowledge, its value. But other people can look at it and say, "No, I don't think it's valuable. No, I think the earth is flat. No, I think Jesus rules everything." It's like, you have no way. So this person, they come and they start, and then you get into a legal battle with them. I hear the government officials right now tiptoeing when they're saying, "Well, we're not here to discuss whether or berate people or pass judgment. We're here to discuss the facts. And the fact is the vaccine is available and it's effective and it can keep you from dying." No, what you want to do with that information is your own business. They don't turn around and say, so if you don't know that, you're a fucking idiot. But where does Glenn get to stand on his balcony and say, and yeah, so you guys are fucking idiots, right? Like you were talking about science, like, you know, how real science isn't real. Well, the real science is right there, Glenn, and people don't care.
But let's say that I stand on the
So how do you get people to
balcony,
agree? Back to the agree thing, right? Like, and how do you say, well, you're so stupid, you shouldn't be able to vote? Like, you know, are we talking like back into segregation and different classes of humans?
Then
like
I think
your
already,
DNA isn't good enough to be in this country. You know, we're going to ship you out.
but then we're already inside of some kind of frame that we shouldn't be inside of.
No. How do we get out of that frame is the question.
Yeah. So I think we have to go. We have to think a lot simpler now about the vaccine.
But people aren't going to think with you. That's the problem. They're not going to think with you. Go ahead. I don't want to.
The vaccine, that's one issue, right? So I can say whatever I want about that. And if I come with misinformation, then Facebook can say, we don't want this on our platform. YouTube can say, we don't want this on our platform. They can then prevent this from spreading. I'm all for that level of censorship, if you want to call it that. But what I'm speaking about is, if we're speaking about far bigger ideas,
no, it's not about the censorship of the tool. It's not about the censorship of the tool, because somebody else could invent another tool. The thing is that the people having information don't want to accept it for some emotional story, mythical, whatever reason. And, you know, Sapiens makes it very clear that the power of humans and our ability to work in large groups is that we make up our own, what they call imagined orders. It's called imagined orders is the word.
But then I know what you're saying now. But then this.
So how do we deal with all these imagined orders?
Yeah. Okay. This relates to trust, and it relates to science. And if you want the general public to trust science, then a good start could be if we evolve science, and that means bring science out of the universities. The universities can continue, the disciplines, they can continue, but we need a science that is open source, and we need a science that is also more general. For example, where is the science of the good life? This is one of the issues that's often discussed between science and religion. And I think that the truth of the matter is that religion is probably the closest we have to the science of the good life. And one could argue that they exist in 1 trillion versions, some way further evolved than others, etc., etc., etc. But it's not generally accepted as a science. So in my opinion, science is a good example of a very beautiful idea, which has been partly realized, but it's very far from fully realized. And I think that the general public sense a kind of hypocrisy with the professors and the research labs and the people who want to make money off of proprietary data. And this creates a general distrust in institutions, and therefore, unfortunately, a distrust also probably in some very solid, good science that's well founded. So I think this is an issue. It has to do with trust. It has to do with trust in institutions, and it has to do with culture. So what Schmachtenberger talks about cultural evolution and cultural regeneration, that's what would address this. And it's a very big project, but it could also be a project that could solve thousands of problems at once if we could do it right. Yeah, this is a very, very big thing. And like I heard some of, like, when Tom Osher came on and he hit those conspiracy theories, and I think it's a big problem, but it has to do with distrust. And there are reasons why the public don't trust the scientific institutions. Like, is medicine a real science? It's not entirely clear. It has elements of it, but there's clear elements of drug cartels in medicine. So it's a mix, right? And people know it's a mix. I think the general public know that science isn't as pure as the representatives like to say it is, right? And that makes it a little muddy. And I mean, it's a big issue.
There's a bit more ethics in science than there is in politics, but there's corruption in both.
Yeah.
I think there's more corruption in politics than there is in science. And I would, be more likely to expect a scientist to behave ethically than a politician. But I also know scientists who went way off the rails, who departed from the protocols of the scientific method so egregiously that it was laughable. And the example that I spent most time on was cold fusion. There were people working on cold fusion who had departed from the scientific method so egregiously that it was laughable. But you had to be a very diligent and rigorous scientist to observe that, because there were so many details that you had to have a lot of depth of knowledge to detect where they had departed from the scientific method.
Yeah, that's transparency, I guess, might be one of the mechanisms that could help.
It was easy enough to see exactly what they were doing. You had to do a lot of homework to find out exactly how they were running their experiments and what their working hypotheses were and what their measurements and all this kind of stuff was. And you could find the mistakes that they made, but the mistakes were actually pretty subtle, pretty technical. And so you wouldn't know that they had made a mistake unless you really had put quite a bit of time and effort into studying the details of what they were doing.
What about something like, let's say you've done a lot of work and all your data is solid, your research is solid, but then in the interpretation of it, that's where you sneak in some kind of thing. Like I'll give you an example. Like I've listened to Sam Harris talking about free will, and I find myself agreeing with just about everything he says, except his conclusion. It's like he could have said the same arguments that he says, and then he could have concluded, therefore, free will is a real phenomenon. It's just that it's a relative phenomenon in many degrees, and it also doesn't come by itself. You just kind of have to claim it.
Dan Dennett wrote a book quite a long time ago, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, called Elbow Room, The Variety of Free Wills Worth Wanting. It's a very nice book, a very small book, and he thought through this whole question of free will and wrote this little book, Elbow Room, The Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting. And quite recently, in fact, just last week, Brian Greene, who's a very well-known American scientist, applied mathematician who does quantum theory, he was interviewed by Krista Tippett on National Public Radio, and he talked about how is it that he calls this a bag of particles. So here I am, a bag of particles, okay? How can a bag of particles have certain faculties, certain emergent properties like consciousness and being able to reason and being able to have a conversation and do science and have quote unquote free will? And it's a very subtle and fascinating conversation. It's up on the On Being website. It's an hour-long interview. And it's very interesting because he's evolved. He said when he was much younger, he just concluded that free will is a myth. There's no such thing as free will. And then his thinking has, as he's aged and thought more, his thinking has evolved and become much more subtle. And it's very interesting to listen to Krista Tippett interview Brian Greene on this interview that was published last weekend.
Oh, okay. Did he speak with Dennett? Or
No, his interview was with Krista Tippett. You probably don't know. This is the host of a series called On Being that's been on public radio for, I think, 20, 25 years. I don't know, it's a long time. But she interviews all kinds of people in all walks of life, all the way from conventional theology to modern science and literature and, all the walks of life. and they delve into all kinds of interesting issues, from science to spirituality to humanities to entertainment, the arts, everything. It's a very broad spectrum of discussions, and it's interesting to listen to people from all these different walks of life kind of discuss these same, sort of big issues. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What's the purpose of life? Is there free will?
By the way, I have to say that Dan Dennett, I really think he's a fascinating thinker, because he's one of those types. He's sort of very careful and very nuanced and reasonable, and says he doesn't want to claim anything more than he can grant, and yet he does. All his ideas, they go really close into some quite wild stuff, because he basically it all seems to point towards that we are the tip of evolution, and that evolution itself is evolving through humans. And this is why free will becomes so important, because that degree of freedom, that elbow room we have, is our means to be able to actually create a new reality and create a new world. So it's he could have been a lot more exotic in his thinking if he had just been willing to. I mean, maybe it's just a temperamental thing, but if you just follow his ideas, they lead to some pretty interesting places.
When he wrote his book, Consciousness Explained, which came out in the late 1980s, actually, I think just before it was published, or about the time it was published, he came to where I was working. He's at Tufts University, which is in metropolitan Boston, and I'm at the MITRE Corporation, which is right down the street from where I live in the suburbs. And so he was invited to MITRE to give a talk to the employees of MITRE on this, his model of consciousness, and that was forthcoming in his book, Consciousness Explained. And at the end of his presentation, and opened it up to questions from the audience, and I asked him a question, and I was pretty sure when I asked it, I knew his answer, but I wanted to make sure that his answer agreed with what I expected. I said to him, can consciousness arise on an information processing substrate other than an organic human brain? And without hesitation, he said, yes, absolutely. You do not have to have an organic human brain as an information processing substrate for to have consciousness become an emergent property. And I thought that he would answer yes, and he did. This is in 1989. We're talking about, 32 years ago.
But it's the whole question, of course, rests on what he really means by consciousness. It seems to me he's very concerned about memes, has a very informational, mimetic view of consciousness. Yeah. He sometimes calls it as something apps that you download in your neck top, or so he obviously has a very informational view.
Well, in fact, if you say, can your laptop be self-aware? Well, bring up the device manager. There's your answer. The device manager is aware of every single working component of the operating system and its state of well-being. It also has a little piece of code that is in charge of managing that item of the peripheral or whatever it is. So almost all modern systems have an enormously complex self-model. I mean, all those devices that are up on Mars, and they have self-models galore. And like the Hubble telescope, these can all report their state of well-being.
But humans, we also have a self model, right?
Absolutely.
This
It's
is
called the ego.
the ego, the personality, but that is also considered an obstacle
Well,
at
the
some
problem
point.
is that how do you know that your self-model is accurate and not warped? And it's easy for humans to have a warped self-model. For example, narcissism is a classic diagnosis of somebody with a warped self-model.
But can't we know for sure that it is certainly warped? It must be warped because the model can't possibly contain the totality of the being.
Correct. It's always lagging reality. So as a
Yeah.
person evolves, your self-model by definition has to lag it because it takes time to manage and upgrade the self-model. This is one of the reasons, right? For example, I went to get my eyes examined yesterday because this prescription is getting old, and the optometrist has a better model of my state of vision than I do. She has a very technical model of it. She measured it with all kinds of instruments, and she looked into my eyeballs with all. I have nowhere near that level of familiarity with the state of my own vision system. And any doctor is going to know a lot more about what's going on in my body than I do, with a possible exception of my thinking processes. Maybe a psychologist can figure out what's going on in my head better than I can. But, for most of my being, I only have a limited self-model that's going to be missing parts, and other parts are distorted.
Yeah, and maybe
Reality.
and maybe we have many models as well, and so actually I have to go soon, but I wanted to mention one little thing since we mentioned Dan Dennett, because I heard him speak with a guy about free will recently, and he said something really interesting I found about philosophy, and in his opinion, philosophy had made a big mistake when they had tried to construct logical philosophies that were based on logical axioms that can sort of be understood in that way. And he seemed to argue much more for a sort of common sense, experience-based philosophy. And that really resonated with me because I did study a little bit of philosophy at university, and that was my strong impression that there's something wrong here. They're living inside sentences. Somehow it's like it doesn't really relate to life. I feel that philosophy should relate to practical life.
Well, he's got this notion called an intuition pump. Have you come across which is I haven't completely absorbed the concept. I've learned the term intuition pump, and I've read parts of it, but it's a very abstract model. What is an intuition pump? How does it work? What is the affordance that it provides? And it's really hard to come down with a reductionist model of what's an intuition pump.
It's a great word. It's a great word, a great idea. And when he said that, it filled in a spot for me. And what was the word again today? Something that was a really nasty word.
Use you.
It's a nasty word. Don't say that with dyslexia. So
an old English legal term.
Yeah. So the idea of this intuition pump, when I started using that word when I heard it, because it's really what you do as someone who is sense making. And an intuition pump, I think, refined is an analogy that actually works. It's very concise, and it helps pump out the essence of what's trying to be expressed. So the intuition is pumped through an example. So it's like, by me explaining this story to you, it works like a pump to get the ideas out and the water into your glass. So the intuition pump, the idea is to fill your glass with understanding the context of, or the point. Understanding
like a really good metaphor, right?
Yeah,
like
so it's a really good metaphor, an example, and it's a pump because it has the effect of actually doing it now. Like, I'm going to give you this analogy, and it's going to pump the idea. So I think the pumping part is to actually get the movement. So of
Right.
getting from one place. So like I'm saying, if you had the right intuition pump, you might be able to explain to people why they should be able to get vaccinated. But my frustration and my fear is that it doesn't matter what you tell them, other than, you know, even if you give them money, it's like, no, I don't want it twice as much now. It's like,
There's a classic intuition pump that dates back to the dawn of civilization. You know, Umberto Eco said, whereof we cannot express a theory, we must narrate a story instead. You can go all the way back to Gilgamesh, which is the oldest surviving story in all of human literature. And if you think about why did humans invent stories? Why did they invent these narratives? Because first of all, they had no theory. So you can argue that the art of storycraft was the original version of an intuition pump. You tell stories because you don't yet have a theory.
Yeah.
And if you tell enough stories and make enough good stories and the intuition pump works, then you develop a mental model that's a theory that can then supplant the narrative. But you got to start with a story. Most of our theories began as stories. A few, like Einstein, began as a theory, for which is hard to make a story. But most of them started as stories, which then emerged to become theories. I see Heiner's turned his camera on. Maybe he has something to say.
yeah, I was just going to say about the intuition pump as well, is it usually has to do with fundamental stuff that brings forth more. Like it's pumping out of the ground more.
It moves something.
You've tapped into something is another way to say it.
It makes visualizable something that's very abstract.
It makes it apparent and something you want to talk about. So maybe Heiner wants to talk about something. I don't know. It seems like he's having technical difficulties.
You want to say something, Heiner? You had your camera on. Turn it back off again. He's got his sound on.
He's invited.
Well, give him a second. Maybe he's got to punch a few buttons or something.
He's got a lot of things on the go, that guy.
The word was usufruct. That's not good. Usufruct.
I don't even think that'll make it into translation.
I'll tell you funny. I like to make up cutesy expressions, and so if you need a snappy comeback to say somebody proposes some silly idea, some piece of nonsense, and you don't want to just say nonsense. Okay. So I made up this comeback. Far be it from me to usufruct such tumid balderdash. Far be it from me to usufruct such tumid balderdash. It's one of those things like, first of all, when you say it, nobody knows what you just said. But then when they figure out what it says, first they laugh, and then they realize you just said that's a bunch of nonsense, a bunch of hooey, baloney, malarkey. But pardon me to enjoy the, to make use of the value of what you just said. Far be it for me to usufruct such tumid balderdash.
On that note, guys, I'm gotta go. Yeah, enjoyed it. So looking forward to the continuation of the focused racing plan.
The new formats.
Well, it's not so new. We tried more or less the same before, but it works. It's a good format.
Yeah, and I've kind of been that way all along, hoping there'd be formats to focus on people's gifts and different ways too, because people express themselves better when they're not interrupted, or they want interruptions, or it's a lecture or presentation, or for me it's always usually back and forth.
But leaning in is important. It's like that's the most important, I think, is just that attitude of leaning in and being interested, and
and the after show.
The
after show is a thing too, right? Heiner's on the after show, and I think he's in a van.
Well,
Heiner, you're on the air. Guys. Say something, Heiner.
Yeah. Bye.
See you later, Glenn. Have a good day.
Heiner, you're on. Heiner?
Yes, good night and good luck.
Nice to see you all the way from Germany. Wonderful.
Yes, we are getting some heavy rain.
Oh.
And I was listening a little bit to you, but I had some business in the neighborhood. Yes. And in another session. I think we are getting somewhere. And I think we have to get the transcribing of what is said in sessions to 95% at least. and then some editing to get the new terms properly spelled, because otherwise all this thing is just of the level of noise. Anyway, I enjoyed the session, and I really enjoyed that you could not leave, but you did it here in the new marathon. So you get the bronze this time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you later. Thanks for your approval.
I have nothing to approve. I just appreciate.
Come on. Yeah, enjoy. All right, Barry, I think.
Well, I think I'll sign off. I'm going to save the chat. You might want to save your copy of it too.
Yeah,
So
I fixed that tool up a little bit. Unless I rerun all the searches, it's still going to have that dead space where the video.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
But you did have some suggestions in there, and I'm hoping to be able to put those so at least you can get the first layer.
Yeah, like I said, I really would like to know who is introducing new terms of art that are catching on, and who is catching on to and beginning to use them. I think that's a useful piece of research in meta communication.
Yeah, well, another thing to do, like, you can take it as an offer for me during, you know, our time on Saturday for me to be doing searches on the side. So we can kind of work, you know, handing off like, oh, I found this and I'd love you to search for this next. And then I can, you know, we can continue to do that until the tool is actually available.
Yeah, do it with some of the terms in Sam's glossary. Find some of the interesting terms where we don't really know who introduced it.
Yeah.
Or who picked it up and began to use it, and just do a dozen of them or something.
Well,
Right? Random.
I'm thinking of if we marked the terms in the dictionary that are important to us, then those could be picked up and we could put those as the input, the impetus for doing the search and doing the show. So we start with the terminology, we define what we think we say, and then we can go back and look what we have tried to say and how. I think the lesson is, how can we say it better?
Yeah. See, I have a working hypothesis that a lot of the terms that you use, I think you got most of them from Sam and maybe some from Glenn, but that's just a working hypothesis. And I would like to see the data to see whether I'm on the mark or whether I'm just completely off the mark on that hypothesis.
Well, I can tell you, since I'm alive, that the words that I've picked up, coexistence, I've always felt that, but I think it's fundamental. Understanding. So understanding is the umbrella word for me. Everything follows under that. All the kindness, all the wisdom, everything. If you don't have understanding, you got none of it.
Mapping from Sam, or was that your original introduction?
I think I was already doing mind mapping, but mapping's an old word, like the word model. Mapping, model.
Now, I know Sam would use model because he's a systems thinker, and we use model as sort of a very fundamental word in systems thinking.
I think
anyway, that was sort of what was interesting to me is who is introducing new memes, new vocabulary terms, and then who is picking up on them and
Michael Josefitz put in nemetics. That was one.
Yeah, he invented memetics. That's true.
Nemetics. Oh yeah. I'm trying to push fair conversation.
No, sorry, nemetics, not memetics. Nemetics.
Yeah, it starts with an N for notice.
Notice, engage, mull, exchange.
Mull, exchange. Yeah. No.
I think that was a backronym, though. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, but that's the idea. It's the iterative process of your journey. It really is.
By the way, notice, engage, mull, exchange is very similar to the Lisp language, which had a 3-phase process. Read, eval, print. Input, process, output. Input, process, out. So read, eval, print, and notice, engage, mull, exchange. That was almost identical to read, eval, print, which goes all the way back to the 1960s. Which is what a computer does. You know, it takes an input, processes it, gives you an output.
Yep. Yeah, well, then that's just it. And sometimes if you've got things lined up well, like Heiner was saying, the transcript is accurate, then a search tool can work good. But if you're trying to search for something that's spelt wrong, it takes a little extra skill. And, you know, there's some other fine tuning that we can do along the way. Like, I've only hit the surface of all the things I've done. With the word cloud, wouldn't it be nice if that word cloud went through some, you know, some of the NLP things, natural language processing, took out the common words you don't want to find, and then made the map clickable. So when you click on a word in the map, it goes and does another search on that word and presents it to you. And then
maybe even color code it as to for the identity of the person who used it.
one of the next things I want to do is go through and just take what I have, which I consider it AI, you know, a computer searching through the terminology and just show me the results, whether they mean anything or not. And then we could go through and click, I like this. So basically when you click a thing and see 10 seconds, not only do I like this, but I want to bookmark this particular thing and extract it so that we can end up with a playlist of some of the better stuff out of the hamster wheel. You know what I mean? Like, how do we lift the stuff out of there is the question.
You could even give it a 0 to 10 level of value.
Right.
0 means no, 0 value, and 10 means maximum value. And you could have a scale of 1 to 10 or something, 0 to 10.
And I think it would be very interesting for someone like Stacy to watch a conversation between two people who don't really align in their personal lives, but they could align very well academically. And you could actually see that, you know, you could see those differences on sliders or whatever, but at the same time, someone would predict that these people aren't going to be able to do any work together, where I say, well, if they're thinking about it properly, then they should be able to get past their personal differences for the betterment of, like what Josh was talking about, you know.
Does anybody use the term common ground in GCC conversations?
That's a good search term.
Common ground is a very powerful term, and I don't really hear people use it very often, but whenever you meet somebody for the first time, one of the first things that people do is they look for their common ground.
Yeah.
They have in common, and then they build out from there. And sometimes you meet somebody and go, I can't find any common ground with this person. Wherever I am, they ain't there. They're over there. Wherever they are, I ain't. And so there's no bridge.
Very much so. And I call those things typically problems like how people have different worldviews. That's one of the tergiversation. What's that word?
Tergiversation.
Tergiversation is different worldviews that they're just going to.
Like, tergiversation means talking at length without actually saying anything.
Yeah, that's nasty. No, I guess I'm adding tergiversation where somebody doesn't care what you're going to say. So before you waste your time into tergiversation,
right,
which somebody else might find valuable, right? So how do you, and it is about filtering that feedback. Like, you know, I like the fact that you got something to give, but could you be more specific or something like that? And, you know, you can give people feedback. I think that's valuable. To tell somebody you're not interested in what, you don't care about what they think, that you kind of just got to ignore stuff like that, because that's just emotion and action. I would hope in this kind of a forum, I wouldn't want someone to say that can't open
But, you know, if you look at classic drama where you have just the protagonist and the antagonist, by definition, they begin with no common ground. That whatever one believes or says or thinks or wants to do, it's the opposite of what the other one says or thinks or wants to do. And sometimes it's a tragedy. They basically beat each other to death. And sometimes it's a love story. And love stories are where they start off with nothing in common and they create something in common, which is a bond. And sometimes you have a tragedy. And
well, I propose that I have a lot more in common with Doug and you than you guys want to admit, but I can see it. Sam can see it. And I think, you know, how do we highlight that without?
Well, then I would simply say, what is the canonical name of that which we have most in common?
I would say a pursuit for reality, sense making.
Okay, sense making and functional models. Yeah.
Yeah. Science, like that puts you over 50% with me with, you know, caring what you think if you respect science. Like I even respect Glenn, but I got to be, you know, a little bit careful because Glenn might have a bias when it comes to science, but I don't think he does. I think he has a bias with the way that people abuse science.
Well, that's a big problem. In fact, I was rather startled when Joshua said, among all of us who were present one day, that he considered me to be the only person who is conscientiously scientific at all times. that people are sometimes scientific and sometimes unscientific. And he pointed out that of all the people he knew, he said that I was most consistently scientific, which startled me because I didn't think I was, that diligent. Although I do try to be diligent about being scientific in all issues as much as I can be.
Well, we try to be. And the thing is if what ruins it for me is when somebody, number one, is a bully, which I would consider academically arrogant, or they're closed-minded, which means that, like, you could give them all the evidence on, scientific evidence of vaccines, but they just aren't going to accept it. They feel differently. I feel differently about the facts.
Darwin, that's some challenges. It's up to Darwin to have them die off. That's it.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
It's like go meet Mr. Darwin. He'll tell you what's going to happen.
Yeah, you're signing up for the Darwin Awards, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So some people, it's no point. You say, okay, you're on the wrong side of history, I believe, and if I'm correct that you're on the wrong side of history, you're going to go extinct. Your tribe is going to go extinct, and a lot of tribes went extinct.
Unfortunately, there's a little bit of spillover, and you kind of got to look at that in the statistics, not in the individuals lose, but statistically over a large period of time, the shift. So some people are going to get thrown out with the bathwater.
Anyway, I think we should. It's almost 3 o'clock. I think we should shut this off. I've saved the chat.
Okay. Well, I got one little present for you to leave. I just did a search on Common Ground. You wanted to know. It's been found 51 times in 39 files out of about 600 we searched.
Yeah, I'm not too surprised. It is a pretty common phrase in.
Now, if you look here at this viddery, I'll show you one more time. If you go to this viddery, that's not the one online. Here's the one online. So at the top, there's GCC and Feynman, but these are the different corpuses, like Schmockenberger could be up here and a whole bunch more, right? So if you click on GCC, the last one it was frustration. The next one I'm going to put up there is Common Ground. So you can just wait and come back to this site and there'll be some here. And I wouldn't be surprised if you end up being the catalyst for this list becoming long. People are interested.
Sam said I put in more entries than anybody else, which may be true. I didn't count them.
To me, it's interest, and I don't mind. I don't want to beg for people to listen to me. I want them to know they're interested, so I'm not wasting my breath.
Well, the main thing, at least for me, is to be concise and be brief, because after about 2 paragraphs, I can't process anymore.
I'm bad for that. I'm bad for that.
The ability to stay, in sync with the speaker who's gone over about 2 paragraphs.
And there needs to be a button for that.
No.
We just lost Barry. Do you care? Yes, we care. Let's stop and go back. And what is it, Barry? How did we lose you?
And that's why I say, and Sam says this, whatever you're going to say, if you have something important to say, put it in writing first, make it very concise in writing, and then use that as your script, which is the model I use. Almost everything I say, I've already written about before.
Now I want to see this screen sharing option you're talking about. I couldn't see it because Glenn had screen sharing, but one participant, advanced sharing options. Here we go. Only host, multiple participants. No. One participant can share at a time. Multiple participants can share simultaneously. Dual monitors. I didn't know that.
That must be a new feature.
Yeah, that's new, but I don't.
Sam owns a more premium version of Zoom than almost anybody, except he doesn't have closed captioning, I don't think. Well, yes, he does. Oh, Sam's got. Wait a minute. Oh, but he hasn't subscribed to it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no. You have to plug in your subscription to the service. It's available, but he's got it separately.
Oh, there it is. Share sound. I see it now. Okay, I got it.
No, that's the.
Well, all right. Thank you very much, Barry. It's been a slice.
We will turn this thing off and say goodbye.
Yes. Enjoy Boston. You're in Boston, right?
Suburbs of Boston. 20 minutes from downtown.
Well, have fun.
Bye-bye.